morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It's an honor to serve as your moderator for this critical discussion. We gather here at a pivotal moment in history to reflect on the global trajectory of trans rights and the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead of us. In recent years, the world has witnessed both remarkable progress and alarming setbacks in the fight for trans equality. Looking back to 2023, we saw countries like Spain and Finland adopt self-determination-based legal gender recognition, while others, such as Moldova, strengthened protections against hate crimes and discrimination. Iceland even surpassed Malta to lead the Trans Rights Index, setting an example for inclusivity. Yet, alongside these states where legislative efforts sought to restrict healthcare access and erase gender identity from public life. Fast forward to 2025, and the stakes have only grown higher. In some regions, we see a troubling escalation of laws targeting trans individuals, especially the youth, through bans on gender-affirming care and restrictions on identity documentation. Meanwhile, globally, trans communities continue to face violence, discrimination, and systemic barriers that demand urgent action. These realities underscore why conversations like ours, like the one we're having today, are not just important, they are necessary. This webinar is more than a discussion, it is a call to action. As we examine the progress made since 2012 and confront the challenges of today, let us commit ourselves to fostering understanding, advocating for policy change, and creating a world where every individual can live authentically and with dignity. Thank you for being here. Before we dive into this crucial conversation, I just would like to highlight that we do have Spanish interpretation for this webinar, which you can access if you click on the globe on your screen and choose the Spanish interpretation feature. And with that, I will introduce our esteemed panel to you. This morning, we have Alma Aguilar Betancourt, who is a trans woman and human rights defender from Colombia with an MA in human rights and a cultural diversity from the University of Essex. She has worked for many organizations and is currently with United Trans. Next up, we have Oscar Fitzpatrick, a multidisciplinary advocate, facilitator, and researcher based in Dublin, Ireland. Oscar holds a master's degree in human, media, and digital culture from the University of Amsterdam, specializing in digital citizenship and anti-gender violence research. He's with ILGA World. Lastly, we have Tamposi Motopeng, also known as TP, who is not yet on the screen, but is joining us shortly. He's a well-known LGBTIQ+ activist and human rights defender who heads the People's Matrix Association in Lesotho. He is a vibrant trans leader who has made significant contributions to the LGBTIQ+ movement in that country, representing the community in both various local and international fora. With that, we will dive straight in. The first questions, I'll ask you two questions, Alma, and I will give you 8 minutes in which to respond to both questions. And the questions are, can you tell us about the Ley Integral Trans, which is the comprehensive trans law, presented to Congress in Colombia in July 2024? Including its current status and the impact on the trans community in Colombia, and also mention the ongoing challenges that trans people face in accessing legal gender recognition despite existing protections and any effects being made to address these barriers. The next question is, as the far-right movement continues to gain traction, we have recently witnessed a rollback of trans people's rights in Argentina. The government of President Javier Milei has enacted decrees 61/2025 and 62/2025, which effectively prohibit trans women from being housed in women's prisons and restrict access to gender-affirming health care for minors under 18. Has this development had any impact on trans people's rights in Colombia? If so, in what ways has it done so?
Thank you very much, Vicky. First of all, I would like to thank Outright for creating this webinar so important, and in order to answer to your question regarding Ley Integral Trans, it is a project that was born from the need that we have trans people in Colombia, taking into account the different political advances that have created the current protections that we had. This law was created because even if in Colombia we have some right or was recognized for the institutional court towards trans people, if we check Colombian laws, there are still some gaps in terms of action that and due to these gaps, we have a violation of our rights. This law was created and promoted by trans people and non-binary people, and this is one of the most integrated processes that has ever happened in similar processes. We had some dialogues at a local and national level, and there was a participation of more than 1,300 people, both trans and non-binary people from the whole country. This is a pretty enlarged process that includes all the needs, like the most important needs identified by the different trans sectors of the countries. And all those needs are included in a document that want to create a legal framework, unified one, that ensure that trans people, they can have their rights respected. In this bill, we have a chapter that looks for to facilitate the change of name and the correction of sex in ID documents. This change is already possible in Colombia, and it is based through self-determination. However, we are still facing some access barriers linked to the awareness raising that do not exist in public services, or another barrier is, for example, the high cost of this process, and this is a big problem for trans people. Apart from that, within the project, we can see some different affirmative measures that the Colombian state need to guarantee in order to guarantee social and cultural rights for trans people, as well as political rights such as working, education, housing, sport, and safety rights, among others. The bill was presented in July, as you said. It was presented before the Congress so that the law will be passed. It had the support of 35 people from the Congress, and so right now we are just waiting them to vote. Regarding the second part of the question that you just asked, if I'm not mistaken, you were mentioning the challenges that still exist in Colombia. So during my work in Colombia, I've been supporting some organizative processes of indigenous communities and trans communities that live in rural areas. Unfortunately, although all this legal progress that we are seeing, all these people are still suffering. As we said, rights are essential for our communities, and we need to take into account the specific needs of those groups that has been vulnerabilized historically among the trans sectors. Because, for example, I am a trans migrant women that I had the privilege to be able to study human rights. So for me, it was easier to understand this process, but it will be harder to understand all the things that are going on to an indigenous women. In the case of indigenous communities in Colombia, we see that normally they are not registered. And we're not only talking about indigenous trans communities, we are talking in general. So that means that having an ID is not something common for many people in indigenous people, because they don't feel that these documents are that important, because they g- they grow without being registered. They did not even understood how they were registered um, once they were kids. So we want to share with them that it is really important for them to have ID, because having this ID allow them to have access to health, for example. Otherwise, they cannot access health systems because they do not have a document that will allow them to access healthcare systems. And the current process of gender recognition did not take all those elements into account. So for me, recognizing ID, it is essential. For indigenous people in Colombia, it can take years and years to get their ID. And this is why we need to have public support and the necessary resources in order to be able to pay for all this process. Once they receive this ID, they need to be able to change their name and their gender. So the process that people from rural areas live, it is way harder than the process that people from cities go through. And then there was a question related to if there was a direct relationship between what is happening in Argentina and how are we living this anti-right movement in Colombia. So I would say that right now in Colombia, there are some kind of dialogues and actions that are leadered by the the far right parties, and they want to reduce the access to affirmative healthcare systems to trans people. And of course, what they want to do is to undermine the all the rights of trans peoples. And I think that there is a direct relationship between these two phenomenon. As it is happening in Argentina, we are feeling that this shows that there is a change, a socio-political change at a global level that is allowing the reinforcement of anti-rights sectors, and they have been able to mobilize and to ensure funds. We can see this at a political level. And so this is why they have been sharing with the population all these anti-right speeches that they use against trans people. This is what we see all around the world. As we know, this has been promoted by many organizations that are located in the global north, like Family Watch International Fund. And apart from finding all these anti-rights movements, they have used this anti-rights speech in order to, let's say, protect family values and the childhood all around the world. So this is why we are ending having like some political leaders like Trump or Milei. Those people, they don't know anything about trans rights and trans people. And they are having those roles saying that they are going to save the order, the family. And so these kind of anti-right speeches at a global level, they are taking a new shape. They're taking into account each one of the characteristic of contexts, and they are creating hate towards trans people. And we can see it through these orders that we're promoting in Argentina. We can also see it in Colombia. In Colombia, for example, we are seeing that violence against trans people is increasing. We are seeing, for example, how in Colombia there are new campaigns that try to clean the society. What they want to do is like to end with trans people. They don't want to have trans people in rural areas, and even in cities we are seeing this kind of campaign. This was something that we were not seeing for many, many years. And this is not a coincidence. These actions are there because we are having an anti-trans discourse all around the world. We are seeing this speech, this discourse publicly all around. And it is a speech that is mobilizing many, many lies and many fears. This is why these kind of actions are back in society, and we are not feeling safe. This is why they are having like bad ideas and negative ideas through trans people from a general
Thank you,
audience.
Alma. So moving on to you, Oscar. So we've seen you like as Alma has just said, around the world we're seeing such a huge shift in the way trans people are being viewed, and in Europe we've seen a tug of war in trans people's rights over the past few years. Can you speak to any notable recent developments, both positive and negative? And then moving into Ireland, Ireland's Gender Recognition Act of 2015 is coming under review this year. Do you foresee any threats to its continuation, and what is the likelihood that it will be updated to include non-binary identities, as well as make it a simpler and less costly process for minors?
Thank you so much for those questions, and I'll attempt to sort of bring a bit of a narrative to it. I think similarly to what Alma was saying towards the end about this like landscape being a little bit different than maybe it was 10 years ago when our Gender Recognition Act was introduced in Ireland. Across Europe, there's, as you say, a tug of war. There's sort of progress, there's solidarity, but there's also backsliding, there's rollbacks, there's sort of a normalization, as Alma was saying, of this rhetoric and of this ideology of anti-trans, anti-gender, anti-progress, anti-fact, and anti-science. I think some wins that we can focus on, because I think we will often focus on the sort of negative things, the losses, which are very important to discuss, but we also have some progress. If I say it right, the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled, I believe, just last month, in this past month rather, that Romania must recognize the gender recognition of an individual that was granted in the UK, while the UK was under the within the European Union. And not only for this individual has the ruling granted them access to affirming gender recognition. Apology, my cat is now running around behind me. I think it now marks a bit of an impact across Europe for member states, because it remarks that the refusal to recognize one member state's legal process, whether that be gender recognition or something else, it's contrary to the rights of EU citizens. So this individual in Romania now is able to access their legal gender recognition, which was granted in the UK. Whether or not this process has on paper been completed yet, I'm not too sure. And then I think there's also a bit of a stronghold in Europe that we can maybe not consider them allies 100%, because it's always good to critique member states and governments that engage with us. There's a stronghold, I think, of progressive nations within Europe that maintain their allyship to the trans community within legislation. I'm thinking of Ireland in our gender recognition process, although we have a lot of other issues, which I'll get to later. Spain and Germany, I believe that those three countries in particular have access for trans refugees and asylum seekers to engage in gender recognition processes, or they can claim refugee status based on their trans identity. I think that those sort of positive allyship moments and sort of moments of legislative action are worth recognizing continuously. But I think that the losses and rollbacks are probably worth documenting as well. I think we've seen some legislative rollbacks. For example, Hungary have banned legal gender recognition. Russia have prohibited the medical and paper transition, I guess. There's a normalization of this anti-trans rhetoric that we've seen across the board, not just in Europe, but abroad, elsewhere globally. I think there's a bit more of a normalization of anti-gender rhetoric. And I think that we've also seen an increase in violence and polarization, both socially and I guess in the landscape of actual physical violence that people are reporting, whether or not that's covered under protections of hate speech, hate crime, whatever it is. But I think that that sort of leads into this specific Irish context that your second question speaks to, which is about our Gender Recognition Act. So in Ireland, we introduced a Gender Recognition Act. It was made accessible in 2015. I think I accessed it in the first week of it being available. I think my number of my cert is under 100, so I was one of the first 100 people to do it. It was then reviewed in 2018, and it's currently under review again. So essentially what the Legal Gender Recognition Act in Ireland enables is gender by self-declaration, self-determination. No, for people over the age of 17, there's no requirement for any medical intervention, any analysis from a psychologist or a mental health professional. The access is different for those under the age of 18. There are provisions in place, but realistically, the time that it takes to access the 16 to 17 pathway for legal gender recognition, it's just not timely enough for it to be reasonable for people. It also has a high degree of additional documentation that's required and support from parents or guardians that can be difficult to access for people under the age of 17. There's absolutely no provisions for people under the age of 16 in Ireland to access legal gender recognition, and there's no provisions for anything other than binary male and female. What's worth noting, I think, in our gender recognition recognition beyond its self-determination aspect is that there is a low or no cost associated with the gender recognition itself. The costs are associated with updating some documents. Your passport will cost money to update. It costs 20 euros, I believe, to get a new birth certificate. But the process itself enables legal gender recognition and name change at the same time for those who are over the age of 18. You don't have to complete an additional deed poll, which is how you would otherwise change your name. And that allows for people to do both of those things at the same time. And the act itself also, in its wording, says that sex and gender are then considered for all intents and purposes to be the one that is declared on your passport or on your documentation of your gender recognition certificate. So according to the state, with my gender recognition certificate, everything is male and sex and gender are conflated in the wording of that. But what that brings into question is the current landscape. In the past week, the Irish government has issued travel advice for trans citizens coming from Ireland traveling to the US because of the recent executive orders around gender recognition. Ireland is a visa waiver country, we have an ESTA program with the United States, and they've now issued a travel warning for trans citizens of Ireland to consider or reconsider traveling to the US and to contact the government prior to traveling because of the phrasing of these new executive orders, it circumnavigates our understanding of sex and gender being changed on all original documentation because the wording of it requires documentation of sex assigned at birth, which doesn't really match up with our system of changing sex assigned at birth with the legal gender recognition. So honestly, we're not too sure what it looks like now moving into like broader applications of the legal gender recognition and what it does when other nations aren't upholding international best practices. For our current review of the legal gender recognition, there's sort of two main points that have always been noted since the beginning of our gender recognition process, and that's provisions for people under the age of 18, specifically in the 16 to 17 bracket, and then again, secondarily provisions for those under the age of 16. And the second piece is recognition of any non-binary or gender X or no gender marker in your documentation. I think ultimately the review process is currently happening. I mean, in the last week, the Trans Equality Network Ireland have been engaging in a community consultation for the process. I think that there is overwhelmingly positive general discourse in the Irish governmental landscape and sort of the policy and the allies that we've held since 2015. I think there's still a culture of allyship and there's a broad understanding of the impact of the Gender Recognition Act in Ireland. And it's I think I said it whenever I speak about this, the lack of the sky falling in. We've had this for 10 years and Ireland is still standing. We haven't sunk. Gender hasn't fallen apart. We still have single-sex schools. We still have segregated sex spaces. We also have reasonable access to documentation that enables people to live an easier life. And I think that there is a cultural understanding of that. Maybe I'm being a little bit naive, but I think across the board there is an understanding of these documents having a low negative impact in the country. I anticipate, in all honesty, that it'll be one of the two things are given to us in the current review of the Gender Recognition Act, either provisions for those between the ages of 16 and 17 or provisions for non-binary and non-gender markers. I think the reality is we're more likely to get that second one in the current conception of the process, purely because there's more of a standardization of the need for gender X or non-gendered passports within Europe, within the member states, as we've sort of seen with the CJ ruling. There's a need for us to standardize with other countries that would have gender X. So I anticipate that that's probably the pathway that people are going to be able to justify if we're going to get one of the two. I would hope that we get provisions for both to be shifted because it's been the demand since the beginning, and even since before the inception of the Gender Recognition Act, when Lydia Foy was engaging in her court proceedings in the early 2000s in Ireland. And there's always been a need and a call for the solidarity for those under the age of 18 and for people who don't identify with the binary recognition. I think that, as I think we'll speak to in the next section, there's sort of a broader landscape that makes all of this a little bit more complicated and tiring. And I think you can see across all of our faces the sort of nodding of understanding exactly why we're all quite tired of having to deal with this this globally. And the normalization of the rhetoric, I think, makes it all a little bit more complicated. And we have another couple of instances of positive action within Ireland and sort of moments of community solidarity. And I think that the context of Ireland, I mean, within Europe and broader on a global landscape, there's, based on the TGEU map, we're sort of exactly halfway. We've got very few other markers are filled in the TGEU map, which I'll send in a minute. I think it's one of the stronger resources available just to get a glance of the issues across Europe specifically. I mean, Ireland is lacking the age restriction, the minor stuff, the non-binary recognition. We're lacking a lot of non-discrimination laws. We're lacking hate speech and hate crime laws. We're lacking some parental and familial recognition for non-binary parents or for non-gendered parents. There's still a way to go. But I envision hope because I think we must envision hope.
Thank you very much, Oscar. That's really great. So our third panelist is having issues trying to join the webinar, so we'll just carry on the discussion and hopefully he can join us shortly. So in light of what we've just heard, and I'd just like us to have a very frank discussion, in the face of the increasing anti-trans rhetoric and legislation that we're seeing, in various parts of the world. We've heard it's in Latin America, it's across Europe, it's in Africa, it's everywhere. What strategies have been most effective in your particular circumstances in Ireland and you could speak to Colombia, Alma, for countering these narratives and for protecting the rights of trans people?
Do you want to go first, Oscar?
I don't mind. If you unmuted first, you're welcome to jump in first.
Yeah, sure. That I can. Well, I work in the Colombian context, of course, but I also work more globally. Right now, I'm working in grant making, especially in the African continent. So I'll speak a little bit of the things I've seen as strategies for both my country, but also I think across the spectrum in different regions. Sorry, I'll go back to Spanish. Digamos que en el contexto colombiano, yo diría
So
que el
in the
arduo
Colombian
trabajo
context,
de
I
las
would say
organizaciones trans y
the hard work
LGBTQ
of
de
trans
sensibilizar sobre estos
organizations,
temas, de hacer
LGBTQ
litigio
organizations, in
estratégico, de
order
crear alianzas estratégicas
to
con otros
create
movimientos,
awareness
con la
about
academia,
these
con los medios de
topics, to create
comunicación, con partidos
alliances with
políticos, con
different
líderes
organizations,
de
with the
opinión,
media,
han
with
sido instrumentales
political
para hacer
parties, with
cara
some
pues, a estas
opinion
narrativas
leaders. They have
falsas de
been
los movimientos
essential in order
antiderechos.
to
También todo el
face
trabajo, por
all
supuesto, de
this
monitoreo,
fake
la
narrative
recolección de
of
datos para
anti-rights
poder
movement.
tener una
Of course, we
incidencia
have
efectiva
also do
basada
some
en la
monitoring
evidencia, ha permitido
work.
desenmascarar pues, todas las
We have
mentiras
been
de
collecting
todos estos
data in
grupos.
order to use
Desde una mirada más global,
evidence-based
como lo
works,
decía,
and this
diría
has
que una
allowed
de las
us to
principales
show
estrategias es
all the lies
entender
shared by these
principalmente quiénes
groups.
son estos
One of the main
actores,
strategies
los
has
principales
been
actores detrás de
to
todas estas
understand
narrativas,
who are
quiénes los
those
apoyan
actors.
y cuáles son
Actors
las
are creating
estrategias y
these
si
kind
es
of narratives.
posible, de dónde vienen sus recursos, que es
Who are they being
fundamental.
supported
Esto último
by,
es muy importante
and
porque el año pasado,
where
por
do they
ejemplo, nos
get
dimos
resources
cuenta
from?
cómo
This
algunos
last
de los
point is
gobiernos
essential
con mayor
because last
presupuesto de
year we
financiación
noticed
internacional
that
a
some of
programas
the
humanitarios
government
de
that has
desarrollo y derechos humanos
highest
estaban financiando tanto a sectores
finding
LGBTIQ+ y feministas
resources
como a los grupos
for
antiderechos.
human rights and
Entender esto es muy importante porque nos permite
development
dirigir
projects.
también
They
nuestros
were
esfuerzos de
financing
incidencia
LGBT
a
groups and anti-right groups.
demandar
Understanding this is essential
cuentas o
so
exigir
that we will
responsabilidad por
have
parte de estos
and
estados, pero también de cualquier
we will
otro
be
tipo de
able
actores
to
que
ask
financien a
them
estos
for being
grupos,
accountable.
que
We need
posiblemente lo
them to be
hagan incluso
accountable.
sin
All
tener
these
pleno
actors that are
conocimiento de cómo
financing these
actúan en
groups,
detrimento de
sometimes
nuestros
they
derechos.
maybe they don't
Y
even
pues hacer esto es muy
know that
importante con el
all
fin
the
de,
groups
como
they are
decía,
having a
reducir
negative
sus fondos
impact in
y
our
sobre todo la
rights.
legitimidad de esos
And this
grupos
is
y acabar con
essential
algunas de
to
esas
reduce
alianzas
their
que han podido
funds, to
formar.
reduce their
Eso
legitimacy,
no
and
será
to
tan posible y
eliminate all
efectivo
those
quizás
alliances that they have
ahora
been
como
able
lo
to
hubiese sido el año
create.
pasado, pues cuando los
Maybe at
gobiernos
this
alrededor del
point,
mundo
this
eran un poco
strategy will
menos
not be as effective as it could
extremistas,
have
por
been last
decir
year,
menos,
because governments last year,
pero sigue siendo una
they
buena
were not
estrategia para
that
entender cómo
extremist.
funcionan
However, I
y
think
poder
it is still a
contrarrestarlos.
good
Yo
strategy
creo que
to
además de esto,
understand how
trabajar de
these
manera
actors work and to
interseccional,
be able
creando
to
solidaridad
reduce
entre los diferentes
their
sectores y los
activities. At
movimientos,
the same time, we
como
need
por
to work in
ejemplo
an
los movimientos
intersectional way
feministas, el
to
sector
create
obrero,
solidarity among
los movimientos
different sectors and
antirracistas, los
movements, for
movimientos para
example, with
contrarrestar
feminist
el cambio
movements,
climático,
the workers' sectors,
perdón, va a ser
anti-racist
clave
movements,
para poder
or
mantener el
just
espacio
climate
cívico
justice
que nos
movements. All
permita
these
continuar existiendo y
collaborations
trabajando
are going to
para
allow
mantener
us
nuestros
to
derechos,
work in the
básicamente,
same
porque como
space so
sabemos,
that
las
we will
cosas
be
se
able to
están
reinforce
tornando
and maintain our
bastante
rights, because as we know,
oscuras.
things are going really badly, and we need to care of everyone. Of course, we need to keep on doing all this awareness raising work in order to keep on doing some loving, and we need to think out of the box. We need to think about new strategies. How can we create relationships between our advocacy work and using new technologies and using the digital world? This is going to be key to get to those audiences that we want to reach. And at the same time, we need to think about new ways to get more funds for our movement, because unfortunately, as we know, resources being over, and most than ever, we need those resources in order to guarantee the health of our movement. All that we have been able to get through all the years, we need to keep that, and we need to keep on struggling and learning one from each other.
I guess I can jump immediately off of that. I think in the Irish context, and I think more broadly in Europe, there's community-led advocacy specifically in Ireland, I think, has been really impactful. We've consistently had a community review, and there's been a community-led process for legal gender recognition, and I think more broadly for the access to medical transition. And I think that the process of the government and of community groups, civil society organizations, of engaging directly with the trans community here has been really impactful, because it allows for us to speak on behalf of ourselves. I think that's just a baseline requirement at this point, and there's I think it's shocking to us to imagine that there's any other process of engaging. But I think that what's quite important in the Irish context as well is for this public education and awareness to be at the forefront of combating these anti-trans, anti-gender, anti-truth rhetorics, because these issues are so constantly evolving, and they're sort of looking for their next buzzword or their next pop culture moment to be able to identify here's the big evil of the trans community. I think it's really important that we're proactive and reactive in creating the content of these awareness campaigns and of these educational processes. In Ireland specifically, I'm thinking of like Shout Out and Belong To and Tenny, who offer education and awareness across all levels, whether this for young school-going children, for high school education, or for third level for the workplace. Anywhere that there are people, these services tend to engage in awareness and training and just sensitivity stuff. That's sort of, again, the baseline of understanding who the trans community is. It sort of demystifies this ongoing rhetoric of demonizing and weaponizing the small portion of the population. And because we're such a small portion of most populations, as Alma said as well, it's really important to lean on inter-community allyship. Like, we cannot exist without our allies in the climate movement, in the sex workers movement, in the union and the trade unionists, the workers movements. In Ireland, the third level students movement has been really positive for affecting this kind of change and creating the awareness. There's also a capacity within some of these spaces to engage in those campaigns, because as Alma said as well, the issue is financial capacity as well as many other kinds of capacity, whether or not it's putting yourself at the forefront to, as a trans person, to engage in this advocacy at great personal cost, or whether it's the financial cost of actually engaging and creating these programs, whether there's backing from governments or civil society or whoever it is to create whatever education program is needed, because our detractors and those who are standing on the other side of the table seem to have this infinite supply of mystery money that is not held to account. And I think, as you said, Anna, as well, it's really important to hold those who would like to consider themselves allies to account, whether they've previously supported us or they state to currently support our communities and our endeavors. Are they also supporting our communities when they're considering their other allies? Are they accepting speaking invitations from organizations that have previously spoken out against our communities? And again, as you say as well, there's this could be held in good faith. You can assume that maybe they don't know that these people or these communities, these groups are engaging in this anti-trans rhetoric. And I think that's, again, part of the problem, is that there's this obfuscation of who is running the show, which sounds like so much of a conspiracy when you say it like that, but there are private groups that are funding a lot of the individual smaller groups. I'm thinking of Turning Point in the US specifically, and sort of how you can always trace back some of the more sensationalist articles or fictitious news pieces or whatever it is to a certain group of negative actors who have a huge amount of spread and are validated by nations, by governments, by other negative actors, platforming them, by bringing, there is value in bringing people to the table for debate, but there's this consistency of extremism in a lot of the debates that we've been seeing in the past couple of years, and an expectation of this extremism, a normalizing of this extremism, which when applied to a lot of communities, including the trans community, is fascist beyond anything else. There's like very specific pipelines to what this rhetoric does and has done in the past. And I think that there's a fear among our allies of calling that out and calling people to account when they're parroting these ideas. And I think that there's a moment currently where the stakes are so high for our community, and we're consistently asked so much of to defend our basic access to human rights. I think the time is well beyond past for our allies to also step up to the plate and to put themselves at risk. It's been very kind and nice for everyone to show up to the Pride Parade, but now we need you to also be ready to fight on our behalf, and to not anticipate the talking points to come directly from the trans community. There are resources available all around the world, and there are groups where you can directly get resources to educate yourselves. While it's useful to talk directly to your trans colleagues and your trans friends, that's a huge amount of emotional labor that I think we're asked of consistently, which can be quite tiring beyond a constant reminder of your rights being at risk. And I think that it's important for our community leaders to become issue experts themselves, and to not consistently rely on only ever having trans voices to speak on their own behalf.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So what does international solidarity look like among trans communities and across movements? I heard you speak, Oscar, about we need to be very deliberate in creating synergies with other movements like disability. But if we look at even within the alphabet, the umbrella alphabet of LGBTIQ, we still work in silos, we still exist in silos. So what does international solidarity look like among ourselves, trans communities? We think of how diverse the trans community itself is globally. Look at the movement in Latin America versus the movement in Africa and what's happening in Europe, which we also fractionalize. So what does that solidarity look like? And how can we strengthen it to combat the global backlash that we are all facing at the same time? And in some places, it's actually it's more pronounced than in others. How do you see this solidarity looking like and working between the movements across the globe? Not only trans, but other movements as well.
I guess I'll jump in first because I forced you to do it last time, Alma. I think that it relates a lot to what we were speaking to previously. The first piece being a precedent setting, I think, is really important to understand that there are intersectional legislative actions and policies that can and have set precedent that enable the support of gender recognition globe, or at least within Europe. I'm going to speak to more specifically, speaking, of course, to the Romanian example rather. That now sort of sets a precedent for legal gender recognition within European member states. But I think we can also take into account the GDPR, while it is in a lot of ways outdated, that can also be used for the data aspect and sort of your right to information. And I think that we can lean on other aspects of protected legislation about your right to associate, your freedom to associate, and your freedom of information of your own data. And there's some aspects that we can sort of take control when we engage in more broad human rights lenses. I think that when we sit in our silo, even as an LGBTI community, as a silo within ourselves, I think we're often lacking positive steps or anchors that we could take that our allies in broader human rights and justice communities would be able to roll off the top of their heads. So I think it's important for us to engage outside of our LGBTI silo. But as you say as well, there's our interletter community discourse and disruption is forever existing, even within trans communities on ourselves. There's constantly some sort of drama, discourse, or discussion, which is part and parcel of why I think it's a really wonderful community to be in. I think we're really good at self-reflection and critical reflection. But I think that specifically in Ireland, and what I see consistently in the Irish context, is a lack of inter-age discourse. I think we sort of have we're very, very fortunate now to have an aging trans population in our country. We are fortunate to now be living longer lives, and we're out in our lives, whether you've been able to come out earlier, later in life. There is an availability of trans elders, at least in Ireland at the moment, that there hadn't been before. And there is a wonderful youth community and a blossoming, ever-growing youth community of young trans people. And those two communities are very much overlapped in a lot of ways, but our language and how we define ourselves and how we communicate about ourselves is just so incredibly different. I like to think that I sit in the middle of those two spaces, but I think some people on the older side would consider me very much on the younger side. And I think that there is a lack of cross-community or cross-age understanding about these things. I think that both groups demand and anticipate a lot of respect and appropriate phrasing and usage of words, and there's a restriction of language, I think, even within a little bit of an age bracket. And I think there has to be a little bit more solidarity in understanding that we're all coming from with the best of intentions, I would like to imagine, for the most part. And that's one of the pieces that I think we can do a lot of work internally to ensure that we're not engaging in ageism. And ageism is very much a two-way street. And I think that it's important that all of our community members reflect on what ageism within the trans community looks like. Because as we age, we are going to need more solidarity across all of our communities. Trans people, as we know, are far less likely to have familial support, let alone older trans populations. So there's sort of a reliance on the community to look after each other, and not let words get in the way that may be defined differently on one part of the internet versus the other. And I can see that Tempose has joined, so I'm going to stop speaking.
Thank you so much, Oscar. So TP, sorry you were having problems joining. So can you quickly in a couple of minutes? By the way, do we have any questions in the question box, Alec? I don't see any on here. That gives us more time to ask questions to TP. But so two questions for you, TP. We are seeing a wave of backlash in the African continent against LGBTIQ people rights in places like Uganda, Ghana, and Kenya. Can you mention if these have any impact on trans people's rights in Lesotho? And number two, what do you envision as the most critical areas for progress of trans people's rights and inclusion in Lesotho in the next 5 years? Are you still there?
Thank you so much. And sorry, thank you so much, and also for your patience. My name is Tampa Simutuping. I work with the People's Matrix Lesotho. Yeah, to answer your question, so looking into the regional influence, the rise of anti-gender, anti-LGBT laws in Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana create a hostile environment that could embolden similar movements in Lesotho. I need to breathe, sorry. Yeah, because I mean, we are in the same region, and also there are also environmental factors that we have to look into that might also reflect in our countries. Looking into the legal reforms, the legal and policy threats that might also come towards us, especially if in the case where I know Lesotho is a bit unique, but also in the case where the government also doesn't pronounce itself. So I want to say, okay, I'm sorry, need to breathe. There's a lot that we can look into, especially abstraction towards legal gender recognition and protection efforts, including the gender identity and inclusion and in the legal framework. Because when we looked into, I think I was tapping into the backlash because of the experience that we had in the country in the previous months, earlier this year, where the MPs were trying to propose some of the changes in the country, and we realized that there's been a lot that was happening, and also provoking discussions around intersex and transgender persons in the identities in the country. That also put us at the corner as trans movement of your hate speech and the hate speeches that have been running across the country. And we felt, as much as we see things from Kenya happening and Uganda and Ghana, at the end of the day, it's about how do we position ourselves in Lesotho to make sure that those also that does not reflect into the context of Lesotho. So social and stigma and safety concerns that are I would like to highlight, like the increased regional hostility can also influence discrimination and violence and exclusion in Lesotho, as is happening in other countries. And more vulnerability to transgender people to be harassed and restricted movement in the service provision. Especially, I'm saying this because we have been relying so much into the US programs, and now the countries are positioning themselves. So it's about having a clear picture or understanding of the clear stand of our countries, whether they are actually looking into the clear standing of the countries. Sorry about that. And there's issue of cross-border dynamics that we were a bit uncertain about, where we understand that as much as activists we can travel around the world, but also there are also high risk that are coming with that, looking into the fact that we are still holding on to the gender markers that do not even reflect ourselves, or do not give us or do not ensure protection to the transgender communities. Yeah, if I may, because I feel like I'm running out of time. Yeah, so there are also strategies that we believe could be looking into the legal and policy advocacy, engaging with the policymakers and legislators also could be one of the key strategies that we can use to ensure that at least the laws that are there that are more protective, including, like I always make referral to our labor code of 2024 and counter domestic violence to see if those could be implemented. Then they could ensure safety and for some of us in the country, especially those who are in the labor markets, and also lobbying for legal gender recognition. I know Lesotho has some promising laws, but also we need to get to the point where laws are very clear to protect trans individuals and to allow people to access services in the country, regardless of their gender identities, or even can access identification that aligns with their gender identities. Looking into partnerships also is one of the key issues that we need to focus on with Ministry of Gender and Social Welfare and other relevant stakeholders for inclusion and for inclusion of to make inclusive policies in the country. Also looking into community strengthening and sensitization and capacity building of the communities and also organizations through the workshops. And like I said, engaging with the government officials, health practitioners, and law enforcers to reduce stigma and discrimination. Contacting training for trans activists also is key, and also looking into their mental health. This I'm saying because we need to equip ourselves with tools for advocacy and our rights. And hosting public dialogues and media engagements is one of the key strategies that I believe could fall under community sensitization and capacity building. So there are also human rights monitoring issues that we always tap into, the ongoing community-led initiatives that we have that help us to document our experiences as individuals in the country, and where we are able to provide feedback. And those kind of the platforms produces the real time information or evidence that can be used to inform advocacy within our respective communities and also country for policy change.
Thank you. Maybe take a breath, TP. Thank you, because questions are coming into the question and answer, and I want to get to them in the last 10 minutes that we have. And I'm sure we can have time to wrap up after we get to these questions. So I have got questions from Jeff Natter and Matuba Matlachi, which are very similar. Jeff Natter says, how have the recent US government anti-trans policies and rhetoric affected political activities in your countries? And in particular, I'm wondering if your governments are using US anti-trans rhetoric to develop policies in your countries. Matuba says, given the weaponization of trans lives in the US, particularly through harmful rhetoric and legislation, have you observed this emboldening actors in other regions to launch similar attacks on trans communities? And how can global solidarity counteract this trend? And I give the three of you 5 minutes to answer this question.
I think I had a little bit of a think about it when I saw it pop in. I think I spoke a little bit to the Irish context that in the last couple of days, I think it was maybe 4 days ago, the Irish government did issue a travel warning for trans citizens entering the US from Ireland, and that's in direct response to the series of executive orders. I think that there's both of these questions speak to the normalization of this rhetoric and the emboldening of certain actors. Again, in the Irish context, there's been a great example of, I think, solidarity, not even solidarity, but an analyzation of what the issue actually is prior to jumping straight into defense of it as an anti-gender moment. There's an ongoing workplace dispute with a second-level teacher in this country who was dismissed from the school, and one party accuses it being due to a lack of respect for our Equalities Act, which includes recognition of people's genders. The other party alleges that there's a different reason for the dismissal, and it's been a back and forth for the past year or so that's involved a severe amount of court proceedings, international attention on court proceedings. There's been a disruption of our justice processes from these actors who don't believe that the rules apply to them. And there's been imprisonment of these actors because of their actions in the court not aligning with the best practices of engaging in legal spaces. And again, this is an emboldening of these actors to engage with a very formal process as though they're children, kicking and screaming and crying, literally being dragged out of the court by their heels. And that's something that we've just never seen in this country before, that kind of total disregard for the formal process of justice, beyond its lack of credibility in the equality space. This is a workplace dispute, and it's being presented as a gender issue, and it's being reported as a trans issue by out-of-country actors. And a lot of the political backing and the financial backing of these individuals and other individuals is alleged to be coming from specific global funders, from private sources outside of this country who have their own path of action, let's say. And again, I say all of this is allegedly because there's ongoing court claims about it. But the normalization of this rhetoric is just so visible to be seen that there is no other context that I can think of where that kind of action in a court of law in this country would be justified, would not be immediately thrown out, immediately sent to prison holding, whatever it is. There's very few other instances that I can consider in this country in my living memory or with the people that I've discussed where this kind of action has been upheld and respected. Credit to the court services, they have shut it down most times. But it's an interesting and I think a worrying development to allow for the platforming of certain political ideology without critique of fact.
Great, thank you. Anything to add in 1 minute, Alma or TP?
I mean, despite from the outcomes of the allegation made on $8 million on LGBTI issues, there hasn't been much because also I'm mentioning it because it also provoked a lot of hate speech towards the trans and LGBTI movement in Lesotho.
Maybe just to contextualize, TP, can you sort of speak about this alleged amount that was meant to have come to your country, which
yeah, the allegation was that Lesotho was allocated $8 million by the US government, which was and also which was supposed to be so-called advocate. I don't want to say it wasn't per se advocacy, but he said it was about promoting LGBTI community work in Lesotho. And unfortunately, we didn't know about that. And also from media, then there was a lot that was being said that the US government is the one that is leading the LGBT movement in the country and promoting it in the country. So it was more of sort of US imposing Basotho to understand us, while that was not true. And also, it has the connotations that some of the MPs are pushing the motions in the parliament simply because they are getting share from the 8 million. So it made a bit difficult for us to also engage with them, and also for us to re-strategize how best to engage with the allies without them feeling like there's a push from back. So yeah, it's a bit sensitive. Thank you.
So thank you so much. So I have one more question in the chat, which we have to get round to in the last sort of 4 minutes. And the question is from Arnaldo de Santana, and it says, are there any campaigns moved in a way to manifest around the trans people living on streets? I talk on behalf of Casa Neon Cunha, a sheltering house directed to people of LGBTQIA+ community that are living on the streets, and we are seeking to get along with some organizations directed to this theme due to the limitations we face daily on our work in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So I'm not sure if we can speak to that. We're speaking of homelessness and shelters and LGBTIQA people.
From Lesotho, we don't have such, but we have a program that is addressing emergency needs of the community. So rather than providing housing and some sort of external support, so what we do, we do mediation support with our allies to make sure that we do, and also sort of dialogues for parents and other community members to understand the community, so that we don't take people out of their homes or out of anywhere where they are, just to make sure that they are back. Otherwise, we don't have much of transgender people in streets from our knowledge as the organization. We are a very small country. We could have known some. Thank you.
Maybe Alma can hand it over to you. You can speak to the...
Claro, digamos que no hay, o bueno, por lo menos no conozco una iniciativa que se enfoque
at least I don't know
particularmente
this
en
kind of
este caso concreto,
initiative
que es de las
that it
personas que no
focuses
tienen hogar o que viven en la calle,
this
que sean
specific
parte de la
case
comunidad trans, pero sí
in
hay un montón de
homeless
iniciativas
people
de
that do
organizaciones
belong
trans
to the
que
trans
buscan
community,
justamente
but
prevenir
there
este
are
tipo de
many
hechos
initiatives from trans
al
organizations
recibir
in order to
incidencia para que las
prevent
personas trans
these
podamos tener acceso
kind
a
of
viviendas
facts.
dignas,
For example,
y
the
también
fact
de alguna
of
manera
allowing trans
capitalizando la
people to
solidaridad
have
de nuestro movimiento y otros grupos
dignified
para
housing,
garantizar que las personas
and
trans que se encuentran en situaciones de movilidad
they are trying to
por
guarantee that trans
conflicto o por
people that
cualquier
are
otra
in
razón, pues puedan
mobility
tener
situation due to the
a
armed
dónde llegar.
conflict or due to
Bueno,
any
eso
other
por este
reasons,
lado,
they
digamos que
can at least have a
pensando
place to
rápidamente
stay.
desde mi cabeza, una de las organizaciones que puedo pensar
And
es la
then
Red Comunitaria
thinking
Trans, que
out
también se
loud,
encarga
one
de
of the
alguna forma de
organizations that I can think
ayudar a
about
las
is
personas
the
trans que
Red
ejercen el trabajo
Comunitaria
sexual,
Trans, that they
que
take care
llegan a
of
Bogotá, por
those trans
ejemplo,
people
a que
that
puedan tener acceso a todo
come to
este tipo
Bogota,
de
and then
derechos. Y
they
para
do
responder un
sex
poco a las
work, so
otras
that
preguntas
trans
muy
people, they
rápidamente,
do have this kind of
claramente también
rights. And
el
answering to the
retiro
rest of the
de los fondos de
questions,
USAID ha tenido un impacto directo desproporcionado para las organizaciones
the
trans en Colombia, que
reduction
ahora
of
realmente
USAID
están
found,
sufriendo
this
un
has
montón
had
para
a
tener
direct
acceso a cualquier
impact
tipo de
in
recursos,
trans
para poder
organizations in
implementar
Colombia, because
trabajos
trans organizations,
como
they are
el
facing
seguimiento a las nuevas políticas que se
difficulties in
están
order
desarrollando
to
para las
have
personas LGBTI,
finance
que sin
enough
este tipo de
money
recursos,
to
pues
do
corre
a
el riesgo
follow-up
de
to
que
all
estas
the
organizaciones ya no
policies
puedan
that we have.
pagar
So the
realmente a
risk
las personas que
for
están ejerciendo este trabajo
organizations
para
is
hacerlo,
that they won't
entablar
be
otros
able
tipos de
to
diálogos
pay
y, bueno, más que nada
workers.
también garantizar
They
que las
won't be
personas
able
trans
to
puedan
have more
sobrevivir en
dialogues
el
with the
contexto
rest
colombiano.
of the parts, and we need more funds to be able to survive in the Colombian context.
Thank you so much, Alma. So I think just to sort of like to latch onto that, it's really difficult, I think, for us to, in this short space of a time, to come up with strategies as to how we can collaborate cross-country and cross-region to address the homelessness of let alone trans people, but LGBTIQ QA people in general, because as we know, that really is it's a major bone of contention as far as we're concerned, due to our lack of being able to work because of we have mismatched identities to our documents and so on and so forth. So it really is a big problem, which is a much bigger systemic problem that needs to be addressed for us to look at speaking to homelessness. And I think we are about at time. I'd like to thank my esteemed panelists, and I'm so glad that you could finally join us, TP. We heard your pearls of wisdom in the last sort of 15 minutes of the webinar. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Alma. And to everybody else out there, thank you for tuning in and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.